There are two types of moral relativism. You have subjectivism and you have conventionalism. Subjectivism is a type of ethical relativism where all moral principles they are not seen as intrinsically good or evil, but they are justified by the individual agent. Conventionalism is the type of ethical relativism that applies to societies where all moral principles they are not considered good or evil, but they are justified by the particular culture where they are located. So whatever society deems to be morally good or morally evil, well, then that's what's morally good and morally evil. Concerning subjectivism, or subjective ethical relativism, an individual determines what is moral and what is not moral. So if an individual says that stealing a candy bar is good and it's moral, then it's good or moral. Whatever an individual thinks is right is right. The reasoning of subjectivism applies to small, minor moral acts and greater moral acts. So whether it's telling a white lie, a small lie, or even murdering somebody, the principle would still hold that if it is right for the individual, if the individual deems that it is morally good, then it's morally good. This obviously would lead to some practical problems because logically it has problems. Logically, it is inconsistent. Subjectivism leads to logical contradictions. For example, if one individual says the statement, "It is wrong that Ted stole the purse," that would be true for that individual. But if another individual says it is not wrong that Ted stole the purse, then that would be true for that individual. Now, if we are talking about the same incident, then both of these contrary statements would be true at the same time and in the same respect. And that would be a contradiction. Both of these statements cannot possibly be true. One must be true and the other one must be false. This is the problem with subjectivism. It leads to this type of absurdity, where we would have to accept the notion that something can both be and not be at the same time. Concerning conventionalism, or conventional ethical relativism, it can be divided into two parts. The first part says that there are no universal moral standards across all societies. And the second part is based on that first part. The second part states that the moral principle and the moral act that somebody commits is dependent on the moral principles that are accepted by that society. So somebody can do an immoral act in one society, but if they did it in another society that accepts that immoral act, then it's not immoral anymore. So the justification of the moral principle is based on the cultural acceptance from the society. Now, there are two critiques of conventionalism. The first one being is that the first premise is false. There are universal moral standards held by all societies. If we just look at the surface, then it's going to be hard to tell what moral principles that all societies share. I mean, we're bound to find one society where they don't hold some particular moral principle. But if we dig a little deeper into some sort of moral standard like telling the truth or not lying, we see that every society would have to have an implied moral standard to tell the truth. It would be impossible for a society to function if there was not a standard of telling the truth. If you did not expect the truth to be told, then how would a society function? How would buying and selling take place? How would even a family that lives together, if there wasn't an implied standard that your mom, your dad, your sister, brother is telling you the truth, then the society, the family, they would not be able to function and just live life. So the moral standard of telling the truth and of not lying, this is an ingrained moral principle that is shared by all societies. So that would refute this first premise from conventional ethical relativism. Another problem with conventional ethical relativism is that it leads to subjectivism. And we saw earlier that subjectivism leads to contradictions. Conventionalism leads to subjective ethical relativism or subjectivism because it is not clear how big a society has to be. For example, let's say that there's a group of people of 100, and throughout time, in a few months, there's some sort of disease that comes in and infiltrates the society, and 50 people die. Now the society consists of only 50 people. And let's also suppose that there's no new people being born. And as the years pass on, more disease and more accidents lead to the diminishing of more people in the society. And so eventually, this society is left with only one person. Now, when this society had 100 people, the morals would have been conventionalism or conventional ethical relativism. So the moral principles were justified by the society. But now this society only has one person. And so the moral principles are still justified by the society they're in. And now this one person justifies the moral principles. What is that? That is subjectivism. Remember, subjectivism is when moral principles or standards are justified by the individual that is acting. And so the same critique that we saw earlier would apply to conventionalism. It leads to subjectivism, and subjectivism leads to contradictions. And we want to avoid doing contradictions because contradictions are absurd.